Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, way back to a morning that might feel utterly alien to your plush modern routine. Imagine, if you will, the gentle, rhythmic creak of timbers settling as the first sliver of dawn breaches a tiny, wattle-and daub window. You're not waking to the gentle purr of a coffee machine or the insistent chirp of a smartphone alarm. Oh no, your alarm clock is the chill seeping through a flimsy wall, the urgent rumble of an empty stomach, and perhaps the faint stirring of your livestock just outside. You probably won't survive this, honestly. The sheer physical grit required for just being in early America. It's enough to make your cozy duvet feel like a superhero cape. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're winding down tonight and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You roll over, or rather, you uncurl yourself from beneath a rough woolen blanket, perhaps shared with a few other family members for warmth. The air is biting, even indoors. There's no central heating here, no instant gratification. Your breath might even mist in the frigid morning air as you ponder the day ahead. The first order of business, even before the thought of food fully solidifies in your mind, is often the fire. Without it, there's no warmth, no light, and certainly no breakfast. You'd be stumbling around in the pre-dawn gloom, shivering, your fingers clumsy with cold. This was the fundamental rhythm of life: fire, then food, then toil. It's a stark contrast to your modern ability to simply flick a switch or press a button. Think of the sheer, foundational effort involved in just starting your day. It wasn't about hitting snooze. It was about ensuring basic survival. Historians still argue whether the initial chill was more impactful than the persistent hunger. For you, the early American settler, it's a tie. Your body aches from yesterday's labor felling trees, tilling rocky soil, mending fences. There's no soft mattress, no ergonomic pillow. You're likely sleeping on a straw tick, maybe a thin feather mattress if you're lucky, off and on the floor, or a simple rope bed. The sounds of morning are different too. Not traffic or distant sirens, but the rustle of straw, the sleepy murmur of family members, and the distant crow of a rooster. A sound that promises a new day, but also new demands. It's a remarkably quiet existence by modern standards, punctuated only by the essential sounds of survival. You learn to appreciate the silence, to find a peculiar comfort in it, even as your stomach grumbles its own morning song. This peaceful quiet, however, often masked the very real, very present challenges of frontier life. Imagine reaching out, not for a smartphone, but for a tinderbox. It's flint and steel, cold against your numb fingers. Every spark is precious, every flicker of flame a triumph. The act of coaxing a fire to life, feeding it, kindling, then larger logs, is a daily ritual, a meditative practice born of necessity. It's a slow burn, literally, to get the hearth ready for the day's cooking. And as you tend to the nascent flames, your thoughts inevitably turn to what meager provisions might be available. There's no pantry stocked with cereals and toaster pastries, no refrigerator humming with milk and juice. Your breakfast is entirely dependent on what you grew, what you hunted, what you preserved, and what you haven't already eaten This daily inventory, often grim, shaped the very fabric of your colonial existence. You'd quickly realize that planning for breakfast was planning for survival. As the fire begins to crackle, casting a warm glow on your rough-hewn dwelling, you finally start to feel the beginnings of life returning to your extremities. This hearth, whether a simple fire pit in the center of a smoky cabin or a more developed stone fireplace in a slightly grander home, is the beating heart of your morning. You might be carefully stacking logs, ensuring good airflow, watching the smoke curl upwards towards the smoke hole or chimney. This wasn't just about warmth. It was about the very possibility of food. Without a proper fire, your options for breakfast were severely limited. Cold, raw sustenance, which, while possible in dire straits, was hardly appealing or nourishing for the hard day ahead. You probably wouldn't have a handy lighter or matchbox, of course. Those are luxuries for another era. Instead, you're using flint and steel, striking them just so to create a spark that catches on tinder. Perhaps some dried leaves, a bit of charcloth, or finely shredded bark. It's a delicate dance, coaxing the tiny ember into a flame, then carefully transferring it to kindling. This daily ritual taught you patience, precision, and a profound respect for fire itself. Historians still argue whether the mastery of fire was a more significant daily achievement than mastering basic carpentry for early settlers. For you, shivering in the dawn, the answer is pretty clear. Warmth first, always. And maybe, just maybe, you'd let out a small, satisfied grunt as the flame took hold, a tiny victory against the pervasive chill. Once the fire is roaring, or at least steadily burning, your focus shifts entirely to the pot or kettle that hangs over it. This is where the magic, or at least the sustenance, happens. You might be scraping the last bits of cornmeal from a sack, or perhaps reaching for a small lump of salt pork. Every ingredient is precious, measured, and used with an almost reverent efficiency. There's no waste here, absolutely none. You're not tossing out stale bread or uneaten leftovers. Every crumb, every scrap has a purpose, often finding its way into the next day's meal. This frugality wasn't a choice. It was an imperative, deeply ingrained by the constant threat of scarcity. Consider the aroma now. It's not the rich, roasted smell of coffee, but perhaps the smoky, earthy scent of boiling cornmeal, or the savory, slightly salty fragrance of simmering meat. These smells, though humble, are deeply comforting, promising the energy you'll need to face the relentless demands of colonial life. You're probably stirring the contents of the pot with a simple wooden ladle, watching for the first signs of readiness. This slow, deliberate process, performed as the sun gradually climbs higher in the sky, is a far cry from the instantaneous satisfaction of a microwave or toaster. You're entirely at the mercy of the flame and the raw ingredients themselves. And if you're lucky, maybe a curious mouse will poke its head out from a crack in the wall, only to quickly retreat, realizing its breakfast is nowhere near as exciting as yours. Even the mice knew how to respect a settler's breakfast. With the fire merrily doing its job, your attention inevitably turns to the undisputed monarch of the early American settlers' breakfast, corn. You'd be hard-pressed to find a day in your colonial life, especially in the earliest settlements, where corn didn't make an appearance, often several times. It was the absolute workhorse of the colonial diet, a culinary marvel that could be transformed into an astonishing variety of dishes with minimal effort and equipment. Forget your fancy artisanal breads or oatmeals. Here, corn was king. You might be stirring a pot of cornmeal mush, a thick, gruel-like concoction made by simply boiling cornmeal in water, or, if you were incredibly fortunate, milk. This wasn't exactly gourmet dining, but it was filling, warm, and provided essential calories for a day of back-breaking labor. The texture would be coarse, perhaps a bit lumpy, a far cry from the smooth, creamy porridges you might find today. This mush, sometimes called hasty pudding, could be eaten plain, or, if you had a bit of luck, drizzled with a precious drop of molasses or a tiny pat of butter, though butter was often reserved for special occasions or sale. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of corn mush contributed to specific dental wear patterns observed in early colonial skeletons. You, however, are just grateful for the warmth it brings to your belly. Beyond mush, corn had other breakfast. You might be carefully flattening rounds of cornmeal dough into johnny cakes or hoe cakes, so named because they were traditionally cooked on a hot hoe or griddle over the open fire. Imagine the sizzling sound as the dough hits the hot metal, the rustic aroma filling the cabin. These flatbreads were hearty, portable, and could be eaten on their own or used to scoop up other bits of food. They were the original breakfast sandwiches, just without the actual sandwich part. And a quick tip for you from a time-traveling perspective: if your johnny cake sticks to the hoe, it's a sign of a truly authentic experience. Or just really bad cooking. The versatility of corn was genuinely astonishing. From that single grain, you could make flour for baking, grits for boiling, or even, through a painstaking process, transform it into hominy, corn kernels soaked in lye to remove the hull, making them more digestible and nutritious. This chemical process, often taught by Native Americans, was a game changer for early settlers, vastly improving the nutritional value of their staple food. It's a quirky tidbit to remember. Your breakfast often involved a mild form of chemistry. Before you even knew what chemistry was, the very landscape around you would be dominated by cornfields in the growing season, a testament to its vital importance. You learned quickly that your survival was intrinsically linked to the success of your corn crop. A bad harvest meant a long, hungry winter, and your breakfast menu would shrink to almost nothing. So, as you stir your mush or flip your johnny cake, you're not just making a meal, you're engaging in a daily ritual of survival, a direct connection to the soil and the cycles of nature that governed your entire existence. And trust me, after a few weeks, you'd probably start having dreams in shades of yellow and beige, punctuated by the crunch of a freshly cooked johnny cake, while corn was your undeniable breakfast champion. It wasn't the only thing on the early American settlers' menu, especially if you were lucky or skilled. The landscape, though challenging, also offered a bounty of wild game and fish, providing much-needed protein and variety. Your breakfast wasn't just about feeling full. It was about getting the energy to chop wood, tent fields, or navigate rough terrain. And for that, meat was invaluable. Imagine waking up to the savory aroma of salt pork sizzling gently over the embers. This was a common sight, as preserving meat through salting was one of the most effective ways to keep it edible without refrigeration. You might carve a thin slice, maybe two, from a slab of this heavily cured pork. It would be intensely salty, requiring sips of water or mush to cut through its richness. This wasn't the lean, crispy bacon you know today. It was a dense, fatty source of calories, perfect for sustaining you through a day of hard labor. You learned to appreciate every bit of that rendered fat, as it often served as the cooking oil for subsequent meals. Sometimes you'd even cook your Johnny cakes right in the leftover salt pork grease. If that's not a breakfast hack, I don't know what is. Beyond the preserved staples. If you or a family member were a good hunter, your breakfast might include freshly caught game. This could be anything from a rabbit snared overnight, a squirrel, or even a wild turkey if you were exceptionally fortunate. Small game was more common for daily meals, requiring less effort and less risk than hunting larger animals. Imagine plucking and gutting a squirrel before dawn, then roasting it on a spit over the fire, its scent mingling with the wood smoke. It sounds grisly to modern ears, perhaps, but for you, it was a vital source of protein and a welcome change from endless corn. Historians still argue whether the early settlers' hunting practices were truly sustainable or if they significantly impacted local wildlife populations. For you, the next meal was the only sustainability that truly mattered. Fishing also provided an accessible source of protein, especially for settlements located near rivers, lakes, or the coast. You might have nets or simple hooks, and a morning catch could include various fish, often small species like perch or trout. These would be quickly gutted and cooked, perhaps fried in a bit of rendered animal fat or simply boiled. The freshness would be undeniable, a taste of the wild bounty surrounding your nascent home. This was truly farm-to-table, or rather forestifier, eating at its most basic, a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, if game or fish were scarce, you might even resort to eating parched corn, dried corn kernels, toasted directly in the ashes of the fire. It's not exactly prime rib, but it keeps the hunger pangs at bay. So, while corn laid the foundational layer of your breakfast, the addition of meats, whether preserved or freshly hunted, provided crucial sustenance and a welcome burst of flavor. These were hearty, no-nonsense meals designed for survival and strenuous activity. A far cry from the leisurely brunches and delicate pastries of later centuries. You ate to live, and every bite, especially of that precious protein, was a step towards enduring another day on the frontier. Beyond the cultivated fields and the hunted game, the early American settler also relied heavily on the bounty of the wild for their breakfast, particularly during leaner times or specific seasons. This meant becoming intimately familiar with the forests, meadows, and riverbanks around your home, searching for foraged delights that could supplement your staple corn and precious meats. This wasn't a leisurely stroll for berries. It was a critical part of your daily food acquisition strategy. You would quickly learn which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous, often through trial and error, or more ideally, through the wisdom passed down from Native American neighbors or earlier, more experienced settlers. Imagine venturing out at first light, perhaps with a simple woven basket or a leather pouch, your eyes scanning the undergrowth. You're not just looking for pretty flowers. You're searching for sustenance. This intimate connection to the land meant you truly understood the rhythm of the seasons and what they offered. One of the most common foraged additions to your breakfast would be wild berries. Depending on the season and your location, this could mean blueberries, cranberries, blackberries, or raspberries. These were a rare treat, offering a burst of sweetness and essential vitamins. Imagine carefully picking them, stained fingers, a small price to pay for the juicy reward. These berries might be eaten fresh, or, if you had enough, perhaps dried for later use. Though fresh was always preferred for breakfast. They could be stirred into your corn mush, adding a welcome tartness, or simply eaten on their own as a quick, refreshing snack before the serious work of the day began. Other wild edibles included various greens and roots. Think of wild onions, ramps, or tender young shoots of certain plants that could be boiled and added to a stool like breakfast, or simply eaten raw. Nuts, like acorns, which required extensive processing to remove tannins, or walnuts, were also valuable, providing fat and protein. Even certain barks were sometimes utilized in desperate times, though these were truly last resorts. This wide array of foraged foods meant that your diet, while repetitive, could also be surprisingly diverse, offering subtle shifts in flavor depending on what the wilderness provided that day. A quirky tidbit, some settlers even learned to identify and prepare edible fungi, though this was a much riskier endeavor given the prevalence of poisonous lookalikes. You definitely wouldn't want to accidentally spice up your morning mush with a death cap. Historians still argue whether the reliance on foraged foods prolonged early colonial survival more than trade with indigenous populations. For you, the answer lay in direct experience, a full stomach, and that full stomach often depended on your ability to find what nature willingly provided. So, as you chewed on a handful of wild nuts or savored a few hard-won berries, you understood that your breakfast wasn't just cooked over a fire. It was deeply connected to the very earth beneath your feet. It's a quiet moment of connection, a subtle reminder that even in the harshest conditions, the land offered a means of sustenance if you knew where to look, even in the harsh simplicity of early American colonial life. The human desire for something beyond mere sustenance persisted. You wouldn't have a sugar bowl filled with refined white granules, nor a spice rack brimming with exotic jars, but you still found ways to introduce sweeteners and spices to your breakfast, making those plain corn-based meals a little more palatable, a little more comforting. These weren't about gourmet flair. They were about making a tough life just a tiny bit sweeter. The primary sweetener, your go-to source of a sugary kick, was almost certainly molasses. This thick, dark syrup, a byproduct of sugar refining, was far more common and affordable than refined sugar itself. Imagine carefully pouring a small, sticky stream of it over your bowl of warm corn mush. It would slowly seep in, turning the bland gruel into something with a deeper, richer flavor. Molasses wasn't just for taste. It also provided a quick burst of energy, much needed for the physical demands of your day. It was a true luxury, though one you might often encounter. A quirky tidbit: some settlers even used molasses in their morning drinks, stirring it into water or weak beer to make it more palatable, essentially creating the colonial version of a sugary soda. Another significant sweetener, especially in regions with abundant maple trees, was maple syrup or maple sugar. This would have been a seasonal treat, harvested in the early spring through the laborious process of tapping trees and boiling down sap. If you were lucky enough to have access to this, imagine the light, earthy sweetness of freshly made maple syrup drizzled over your Johnny cakes. It would be a moment of pure, unadulterated pleasure, a rare burst of natural sweetness in a diet otherwise dominated by savory and bland flavors. This was nature's candy, hard-won but deeply appreciated. As for spices, your options were far more limited than today. Most spices had to be imported and were incredibly expensive, often reserved for medicinal purposes or for the very wealthy. However, you might have access to a few homegrown options. Salt, while not technically a spice, was fundamental. It was used not just for preservation, but also to enhance flavor in almost every dish, including your morning mush or meats. Beyond salt, perhaps you cultivated herbs like sage or thyme in a small garden patch, using them sparingly to add a touch of aromatic complexity to your breakfast meats or porridges. Historians still argue whether the limited availability of spices influenced early American culinary traditions more than the availability of New World ingredients. For you, the answer was simpler. You used what you had. The subtle flavors of a bit of salt, a hint of molasses, or the rare addition of a dried herb were enough to elevate a simple meal from pure necessity to something vaguely enjoyable. These small additions were important. They spoke to the human need for pleasure, even in the most challenging of circumstances. They made the mundane just a little less, mundane. With your stomach rumbling and the fire providing a comforting warmth, your thoughts invariably turn to the morning's hydration. This wasn't a matter of choosing between a latte or a smoothie. Your options for drinks of the dawn were far more practical, designed for sustenance and to ward off the dangers lurking in untreated water. You certainly weren't reaching for a filtered pitcher from the fridge. The most basic and often riskiest drink was plain water. While seemingly simple, early colonial water sources were often contaminated, leading to various illnesses. You quickly learned that drinking directly from a stream or well without some form of treatment was a gamble. So, boiling water for drinking was a common practice, even if it meant a lukewarm, slightly flat taste. This boiling would happen over your trusty fire, and the resulting warm water might be all you had to accompany your hearty corn mush. It was less about taste and more about survival. A quirky tidbit: some settlers would even add a tiny bit of charcoal to their water barrels, believing it helped to purify it, which, surprisingly, had some scientific basis in filtration. However, often preferred over plain water were various low-alcohol beverages. Cider was incredibly common, especially in apple-growing regions. This wasn't the sparkling apple juice you might know today, but a fermented, slightly alcoholic drink made from apples. It was safer than water because the fermentation process killed off many harmful bacteria. You might start your day with a mug of cider, its tartness a refreshing contrast to your savory breakfast. It provided a bit of energy and a mild buzz, certainly not enough to impair your work, but enough to take the edge off the morning chill and the dull ache of a settler's life. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of cider contributed to better public health in the colonies, or merely masked issues of poor sanitation. For you, it was just a daily given. Another common morning beverage, particularly in regions where grain was plentiful, was small beer. This was a very weak, often homebrewed beer, with a low alcohol content typically less than 1 to 2%. Like cider, it was safer to drink than untreated water, and it also offered some caloric value. Imagine sipping a thin, perhaps slightly cloudy, small beer with your Johnny cakes. It wasn't about getting drunk. It was about hydration and avoiding disease. Children often drank small beer too, as it was a safer alternative to the local well. The process of brewing this small beer was often a household chore, a continuous cycle to ensure a steady supply for the family. And then there was the rare, exotic treat, coffee or tea. These were expensive imports, a luxury most early settlers couldn't afford on a daily basis. If you were a more affluent colonist, or perhaps living in a more established urban center, you might occasionally indulge. Imagine the rich, earthy aroma of roasted coffee beans, a truly foreign and delightful scent compared to the smoky air of your cabin, or the delicate, fragrant steam rising from a cup of tea, a taste of distant lands. But for the vast majority, these were dreams, not daily realities. Your breakfast drinks were utilitarian, whatever was safest and most readily available, keeping you hydrated and healthy enough to face the demanding day ahead, beyond the actual food and drink. Your early American settler breakfast was also defined by its mealtime rituals, or rather, the distinct lack of them compared to the elaborate dining customs that would evolve centuries later. This wasn't a leisurely affair with linen, napkins, and polite conversation. It was a practical, often silent, and incredibly efficient process, designed to fuel bodies for immediate labor. Imagine gathering around the crackling hearth, the only real source of light and warmth in your small, perhaps smoky cabin. There might not even be a proper table. You might be sitting on stools, rough-hewn benches, or simply cross-legged on the dirt floor, a wooden bowl held carefully in your hands. There's no ornate crockery. Your plates and bowls are likely made of wood, pewter, or perhaps rough earthenware. Spoons would be wooden or horn. Forks were a rarity, still largely considered an Italian affectation by many. So you'd be using your fingers, a knife, or perhaps a piece of Johnny cake as your primary eating utensil. It's a very hands-on experience, quite literally. The atmosphere was generally subdued. Conversation, if any, would be minimal and functional. There wasn't time for idle chatter or lengthy discussions about the day's plans. Everyone knew their roles, and the immediate task was to consume enough calories to face the impending toil. Children, too, were expected to eat quickly and quietly, understanding the serious nature of the morning meal. There wasn't any negotiation over what they liked or didn't like. You ate what was put in front of you, or you went hungry. A quirky tidbit: some families practiced a form of silent grace before meals, a quiet moment of gratitude for the provisions, acknowledging the ever-present hand of providence in their survival. The concept of separate courses was entirely alien. Everything would be served at once, likely from the communal pot hanging over the fire. You'd scoop out your portion of mush or retrieve a piece of cooked meat, and then it was simply a matter of getting it into your stomach as efficiently as possible. There were no leisurely sips of coffee or lingering over a newspaper. As soon as you finished, you'd be up and preparing for the day's work, whether it was heading to the fields, tending to livestock, or beginning household chores. Historians still argue whether these basic mealtime rituals fostered stronger family bonds or merely reflected the sheer necessity of survival. For you, it was just the way things were, a no-frills start to a no-frills day. So, while your modern breakfast might involve leisurely scrolling through your phone and catching up on the news, your colonial counterpart was a masterclass in efficiency and practicality. It was a stark reminder of the constant struggle for existence, where every calorie counted and every moment was precious. The warmth of the fire, the simple taste of corn, and the quiet camaraderie of shared necessity were the true ingredients of your morning ritual. Preparing your simple breakfast in early America wasn't about fancy kitchen gadgets or a well-stocked utensil drawer. Instead, you relied on ingenious, often rudimentary, tools and techniques that had been passed down through generations or adapted from indigenous practices. Your kitchen was essentially the hearth, and your implements were born of necessity and whatever materials were at hand. The most crucial piece of equipment was the cooking pot or kettle, typically made of cast iron or copper. This heavy, durable vessel would hang directly over the fire on a pot hook or sit on a tripod trivet amidst the embers. It was your primary cooking implement for everything from boiling corn mush to simmering stews. Imagine the comforting weight of it, blackened with years of smoke and use, a silent testament to countless meals prepared. This pot was a prized possession, often passed down through families, as it was essential for daily sustenance. For mixing and stirring, you would rely on wooden ladles and paddles. These were often handmade, perhaps carved from a sturdy branch, smoothed by use. They were simple, effective, and wouldn't scratch your precious ironware. You might even have a wooden pestle and mortar for grinding dried herbs or coarser grains, a rhythmic thudding sound that would accompany your morning preparations. A quirky tidbit: some settlers would even use a split stick or a straightened iron rod to toast bits of meat or bread directly over the flames, essentially crafting the original campfire skewers. Talk about resourceful. Baking, or rather cooking, flatbreads involved another set of specialized yet simple tools. Your Johnny cakes or hoe cakes might be cooked directly on a flat stone heated in the fire, or on a metal plate or actual iron hoe, hence the name, propped over the coals. These flat surfaces were perfect for achieving that signature slightly crisp exterior and soft interior. Imagine flipping these with a broad, flat wooden paddle, the smell of toasted corn filling the air. For tasks like grinding corn into meal, you might use a hand-cranked grist mill if you had one, or more commonly, a simpler mortar and pestle made of stone or wood. This was laborious work, often done the evening before or early in the morning, creating the coarse meal that formed the base of so many breakfasts. The rhythmic sound of grinding corn would be a familiar soundtrack to your daily routine, a constant reminder of the physical effort required to simply put food on the table. Historians still argue whether the simplicity of early colonial cooking tools fostered greater culinary creativity or merely limited dietary options. For you, the settler, it was about functionality. Every tool had a purpose. Every technique was honed by generations of trial and error. You became adept at working with fire, judging temperatures by instinct, and making the most of every precious resource. Your hands were your most important tools, shaping raw ingredients into nourishing meals with skill and quiet determination. While the basic elements of your early American settler breakfast, corn, some form of meat, and simple drinks, remained fairly consistent, there was nevertheless a fascinating degree of regional variation across the diverse colonial settlements. You weren't living in a monolithic culinary landscape. Instead, your morning meal was subtly shaped by geography, available resources, and the cultural heritage of the settlers around you. Imagine yourself on the harsh, rocky coast of New England. Here, seafood would feature much more prominently in your breakfast. You might be starting your day with salted cod or mackerel, perhaps even a bit of boiled lobster if it was plentiful, and it was often considered a poor man's food back then. Clams, mussels, and oysters, gathered from the abundant shoreline, might also make their way into your morning stew. While corn was still important, wheat and rye were also cultivated. So you might occasionally enjoy a rough, dark bread alongside your fish. The colder climate meant a heavier reliance on preserved foods and heartier grains. A quirky tidbit: some New Englanders even made a rudimentary fish chowder for breakfast, a savory, hearty concoction to ward off the morning chill. Now, shift your perspective to the fertile lands of the Middle Colonies, encompassing areas like Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. Here, the landscape was richer, and the mix of European cultures, Dutch, German, Quaker, brought their own influences. You'd likely find more dairy products if you had cattle, meaning milk, butter, and perhaps even cheese, playing a slightly larger role. Wheat was more readily grown here, leading to a greater prevalence of various breads and pancakes made from wheat flour rather than just corn. Imagine a morning with warm, freshly baked bread, perhaps spread with a bit of homemade butter. The breakfast here often felt a little more European in its diversity, reflecting the melting pot of the region. Historians still argue whether the culinary diversity of the Middle Colonies led to greater food security than in other regions. Finally, consider the warmer agrarian landscape of the southern colonies, from Virginia down to Georgia. Here, the climate favored different crops. While corn was still king, you'd also see more rice in some areas, particularly closer to the coast. Sweet potatoes and other root vegetables might also appear. The extensive use of enslaved labor, particularly on large plantations, meant a distinct culinary tradition emerged, often involving simpler, more calorie-dense foods for those working the fields. Pork, both fresh and cured, was a major protein source due to the ease of raising hogs. Imagine a breakfast of grits, a coarser cornmeal preparation common in the South, perhaps mixed with a bit of fatback or a few peas. The influences here would be a blend of English traditions, adapted to the local environment, and the powerful impact of African culinary practices. So, while the core need for sustenance remained universal, your morning meal was a subtle reflection of your precise location. It underscored how the land itself and the people who settled it shaped the very first meal of your demanding day. While the basic elements of your early American settler breakfast, corn, some form of meat, and simple drinks, remained fairly consistent, there was nevertheless a fascinating degree of regional variation across the diverse colonial settlements. You weren't living in a monolithic culinary landscape. Instead, your morning meal was subtly shaped by geography, available resources, and the cultural heritage of the settlers around you. Imagine yourself on the harsh, rocky coast of New England. Here, seafood would feature much more prominently in your breakfast. You might be starting your day with salted cod or mackerel, perhaps even a bit of boiled lobster if it was plentiful, and it was often considered a poor man's food back then. Clams, mussels, and oysters gathered from the abundant shoreline might also make their way into your morning stew. While corn was still important, wheat and rye were also cultivated, so you might occasionally enjoy a rough, dark bread alongside your fish. The colder climate meant a heavier reliance on preserved foods and heartier grains. A quirky tidbit: some New Englanders even made a rudimentary fish chowder for breakfast, a savory, hearty concoction to ward off the morning chill. Now, shift your perspective to the fertile lands of the Middle Colonies, encompassing areas like Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. Here, the landscape was richer, and the mix of European cultures, Dutch, German, Quaker, brought their own influences. You'd likely find more dairy products if you had cattle, meaning milk, butter, and perhaps even cheese playing a slightly larger role. Wheat was more readily grown here, leading to a greater prevalence of various breads and pancakes made from wheat flour rather than just corn. Imagine a morning with warm, freshly baked bread, perhaps spread with a bit of homemade butter. The breakfast here often felt a little more European in its diversity, reflecting the melting pot of the region. Historians still argue whether the culinary diversity of the Middle Colonies led to greater food security than in other regions. Finally, consider the warmer agrarian landscape of the southern colonies, from Virginia down to Georgia. Here, the climate favored different crops. While corn was still king, you'd also see more rice in some areas, particularly closer to the coast. Sweet potatoes and other root vegetables might also appear. The extensive use of enslaved labor, particularly on large plantations, meant a distinct culinary tradition emerged, often involving simpler, more calorie-dense foods for those working the fields. Pork, both fresh and cured, was a major protein source due to the ease of raising hogs. Imagine a breakfast of grits, a coarser cornmeal preparation common in the South, perhaps mixed with a bit of fatback or a few peas. The influences here would be a blend of English traditions adapted to the local environment and the powerful impact of African culinary practices. So, while the core need for sustenance remained universal, your morning meal was a subtle reflection of your precise location. It underscored how the land itself and the people who settled it shaped the very first meal of your demanding day. Stepping further into the nuances of early colonial life, it's crucial to acknowledge that not everyone's breakfast plate was created equal. For many, particularly indentured servants, the morning meal was a stark testament to their subordinate status, a far cry from even the basic fare of a free settler. You might find yourself in their shoes, waking not to the quiet anticipation of a meal, but to the harsh reality of forced labor and meager provisions. Imagine your morning as an indentured servant. Your slumber, if you can even call it that, is often on a rough pallet in a shared, cramped space, perhaps an outbuilding or a loft. There's no personal hearth to tend. Your access to warmth and cooked food is entirely at the discretion of your master or mistress. Your day begins earlier than most, often before dawn, as there are chores to be done: hauling water, feeding livestock, cleaning, before you even consider your own sustenance. The concept of leisurely breakfast simply doesn't exist in your vocabulary. When it comes to the food itself, you're not choosing, you're receiving. Your breakfast would almost invariably be the bare minimum necessary to keep you functional for a day of hard labor. This meant a monotonous diet, even by colonial standards. Most likely, your meal would consist of cornmeal, mush, or gruel, perhaps a slightly thinner, less palatable version than what the free family consumed. It would be prepared with water, rarely milk or any enriching fats, and served without any of the precious sweeteners or occasional meats that might grace your master's table. Imagine swallowing mouthfuls of bland, unseasoned gruel, knowing it's all you'll get until your meager noon meal. A quick, almost silent ingestion of calories, protein, so crucial for strenuous work, would be exceedingly rare for you as an indentured servant. If meat was provided, it would be the cheapest, toughest cuts, or perhaps the offal given sparingly. There would be no fresh game or foraged berries as a treat. Your diet was designed purely for energy, not enjoyment or variety. You'd be lucky to get a piece of hardened biscuit or a few small, dry Johnny cake. Historians still argue whether the nutritional deficiencies in indentured servants' diets significantly impacted their overall health and longevity compared to free colonists. From your perspective, it certainly felt like it was wearing you down. This stark reality highlights the vast social and economic inequalities present even in nascent colonial society. Your breakfast as an indentured servant wasn't a family gathering. It was a solitary, hurried act of fueling your body for another day of servitude. There was no gentle sarcasm in your morning, no odd facts to ponder, just the grim resolve to endure. Every bite was a reminder of your contractual obligation, a necessary step to reach the end of your term, and, perhaps, the promise of a better, more self-sufficient future. You ate to work, not to live. While we've explored your European-derived breakfast habits, it's impossible to talk about early American settler food without acknowledging the profound and indispensable Native American influence. Long before Europeans set foot on these shores, indigenous peoples had perfected techniques for cultivating, preparing, and preserving the very foods that would become staples for the newcomers. Your breakfast, whether you realized it or not, often bore the subtle or not so subtle mark of millennia of indigenous knowledge. Imagine learning how to properly cultivate corn, not just as a random crop, but understanding the best planting techniques, the optimal soil, and the importance of companion planting with beans and squash. This method, known as the Three Sisters, enriched the soil and provided a nutritionally complete diet. You, as a settler, would have either learned these practices directly from Native Americans or from earlier colonists who had, in turn, learned from them. This knowledge was literally life-saving, ensuring successful harvests of the very grain that formed the backbone of your breakfast. A quirky tidbit: the technique of nixtamalization, where corn is soaked in an alkaline solution like lye or lime water to make its nutrients more bioavailable, was a complex chemical process developed by indigenous peoples long before European arrival. This transformed simple corn into a powerhouse of nutrition, and without it, early settlers would have suffered far more from deficiencies. Consider also the preparation methods. The concept of cornmeal mush or grits was not an English invention. It was a variation of indigenous porridges and gruels. The Johnny cake or hoe cake also has strong parallels to Native American flatbreads and corn cakes cooked over open fires. You weren't inventing these techniques from scratch. You were adapting methods already perfected by those who had lived on this land for centuries. The use of gourds as containers, wooden bowls and spoons, and even certain types of fishing and hunting techniques all borrowed heavily from indigenous practices. Even specific ingredients that became iconic American foods were introduced by Native Americans. Think of maple syrup and sugar, discussed earlier as precious sweeteners. The entire process of tapping maple trees and boiling down sap was a skill taught too early. European settlers by various indigenous tribes. Similarly, many varieties of beans, squash, pumpkins, and potatoes, all future staples, were cultivated and shared by Native American communities. Historians still argue whether the culinary exchange was a true collaboration or primarily a one-way adoption by the colonists. For you, it was simply about getting food on the table, and the indigenous knowledge made that possible. So, as you stir your corn mush or flip a Johnny cake, take a quiet moment to acknowledge the silent teachers who, through their profound understanding of the land and its bounty, provided the very foundations of your morning meal. Your breakfast wasn't just colonial. It was a blend of worlds, a testament to the enduring legacy of Native American ingenuity and generosity. Without their profound contributions, your breakfast, and indeed your very survival, would have been a far more difficult and precarious affair. Despite your best efforts at farming, foraging, and hunting, the shadow of hardship and scarcity loomed large over the early American settlers' breakfast table. Life on the frontier was precarious, and a good harvest or successful hunt was never guaranteed. You would learn very quickly the bitter taste of hunger and the constant anxiety of dwindling provisions. Imagine waking up on a cold winter morning, not to the aroma of cooking food, but to the hollow ache in your stomach. Your carefully stored corn has run low, perhaps due to a poor harvest, a persistent pest problem, or even raids. Your hunting efforts have yielded nothing for days. The well-stocked pantry of your modern life is a fantasy here. Your reality is a cupboard that is literally bare or close to it. This was the ever-present specter of famine, a chilling threat that shaped every decision, every chore, every waking thought. You learned to distinguish between mere hunger and true starvation, a distinction no one should ever have to make. When provisions were truly scarce, your breakfast would shrink to its absolute bare essentials. A small handful of parched corn, perhaps eaten dry and slowly to maximize its meager sustenance. Water, if it was clean, became your most important food. You might boil bits of bark or roots, anything to give your stomach something to work on, though these offered little nutritional value. Children, especially, would suffer profoundly during these times. Their small bodies, more vulnerable to the lack of calories and vital nutrients. A quirky tidbit: some desperate settlers would resort to eating their leather boots or even boiling sawdust, though these extreme measures often did more harm than good, offering no real nutrition. The psychological toll of this constant scarcity was immense. Every meal, even when available, was eaten with the awareness that it might be the last for a while. You learned to be profoundly grateful for every morsel, to waste absolutely nothing. The concept of leftovers was alien because there were rarely any to begin with. You would carefully ration your supplies, stretching every kernel of corn and every sliver of salt pork as far as it could possibly go, knowing that your family's survival depended on your prudence. Historians still argue whether the experience of widespread colonial famine led to long-term changes in American dietary habits, or simply reinforced the imperative of self-sufficiency. For you, in the moment, it was about grit. It was about finding every last edible route, setting every desperate snare, and praying for the spring thaw and the promise of new growth. This profound experience of hardship made every subsequent breakfast, no matter how simple, feel like a feast. It taught you a deep, visceral appreciation for food that modern abundance rarely allows. So, as you drift off, perhaps consider the sheer resilience required to simply put food on the table, day after day, in the face of such relentless challenges. As the early American colonies gradually transformed from precarious outposts to more established settlements, so too did the breakfast table begin its slow but steady evolution. You would witness, over the decades, subtle shifts in both the availability of food and the habits surrounding the morning meal, moving away from pure subsistence towards something a little more varied and, dare we say, comfortable. Imagine skipping forward a few decades. The immediate threat of starvation has somewhat receded in more settled areas. Roads are a little better, allowing for more reliable trade. Local industries, like flour mills and distilleries, are becoming more common. This means that while corn remains a staple, you're now more likely to have access to wheat flour on a more consistent basis. This opens up new possibilities for your breakfast. Instead of just Johnny cakes, you might enjoy actual pancakes made from wheat flour, perhaps lighter and fluffier, cooked on a griddle. Biscuits, too, become more common, offering a pleasant change from the coarser cornbread. The availability of more varied livestock also influences your morning meal. While salt pork remains a constant, you might now see more fresh eggs if your chickens are laying well, perhaps fried or scrambled directly in the pan over the fire. Dairy products like milk and butter become more accessible, turning your plain corn mush into a richer, creamier porridge, or allowing for buttered toast. Imagine the simple luxury of spreading fresh butter on a warm piece of bread, a far cry from a dry Johnny cake. A quirky tidbit: as tea and coffee became slightly less exorbitant, wealthier colonists might even begin to adopt the more formal tea time or coffee house rituals of Britain, bringing a touch of refined leisure to their mornings. The focus gradually shifts, even if slightly, from mere survival to a touch of comfort and, for some, even status. While hard labor remains the norm, the urgency of eating quickly to simply fuel your body lessens. There might be a proper wooden table, more consistent seating, and perhaps even some conversation as the morning light grows stronger. Your tools become a bit more specialized too, with iron griddles and pots becoming more common and affordable. Historians still argue whether the increased availability of diverse foods truly improved the general health of colonists, or if new culinary habits introduced different nutritional challenges. From your perspective, the shift was welcome. It meant less grinding, less foraging in desperation, and a slightly more varied, appealing plate. The breakfast, while still hearty and functional, slowly began to incorporate elements of what would eventually become the more familiar morning meals of future generations. It was a subtle yet significant evolution from the raw struggle of the earliest days. As our journey through the misty mornings of early American settlement comes to a gentle close, let's consider the enduring legacy and lasting impact of those humble breakfast habits. What started as a desperate scramble for sustenance laid the very groundwork for the culinary traditions that would evolve in America, shaping not just what people ate, but how they approached the day and even their relationship with food itself. Imagine the subtle echoes of those early corn-based meals resonating through centuries, the prevalence of cornbread, grits, and Johnny cakes in regional American cuisine, particularly in the South, is a direct lineage from those survivalist breakfasts. Even today, these dishes remain comfort foods for many, a nostalgic link to a time when simple ingredients provided essential nourishment. When you see a modern diner offering grits, you're looking at a direct descendant of that original colonial mush, a testament to its enduring power as a fundamental food source. A quirky tidbit, the very word hoe cake is still sometimes used in parts of the South, a delightful linguistic fossil from a time when the cooking surface truly was a garden tool. The emphasis on hearty, filling, and often easily preservable foods also influenced the trajectory of American eating. The resourceful spirit, the make-don't-mend approach to ingredients, and the deep appreciation for every scrap of food. These were lessons hard-learned at the early breakfast table and passed down through generations. This frugality, born of necessity, became ingrained in the national character, a counterpoint to later periods of abundance. Even the idea of a hearty breakfast as fuel for a demanding day has its roots in those colonial mornings where physical labor was the norm and every calorie counted. Beyond the specific foods, the colonial breakfast also subtly shaped broader attitudes. The sheer effort involved in preparing a meal fostered a deep connection to the land and its bounty. You knew where your food came from intimately because you had grown it, hunted it, or processed it yourself. This hands-on relationship with food stands in stark contrast to the often disconnected consumption habits of today. Historians still argue whether this early self-sufficiency ingrained a permanent suspicion of external food sources in the American psyche. For you, it was simply about trusting your own labor and the land beneath your feet. So, as the morning sun finally bathes your modern room in light, reflecting off your familiar surroundings, take a moment to appreciate the quiet strength, the unyielding resilience, and the sheer practicality embodied in those early American breakfasts. They were more than just meals. They were daily acts of survival, ingenuity, and adaptation. They formed the very first link in a long chain of culinary history, a foundational layer upon which centuries of American food culture would be built. Now, as the stories of these resourceful settlers slowly fade and the distant echoes of crackling fires and grinding corn recede, feel your own breath deepen. Let the images of those simple, hearty mornings dissolve like mist in the sun. The hard work of the past has softened into the quiet comfort of your present. Allow yourself to drift, to release any lingering thoughts of ancient grains or a precarious existence. The warmth of your blanket, the stillness of the air around you, let it all envelop you. Feel yourself settling deeper, deeper into comfort. As the sounds of the day begin to dim and the gentle whisper of sleep calls you home, all the demands, all the efforts of a bygone era are now simply a quiet tale told. Let yourself surrender to the soft embrace of the night, knowing that rest is well earned. Close your eyes and just be.